We will now commence the first leadership dialogue for the forum, which will focus on the clean energy transition, the GCC's opportunity towards world leadership. Dr. Patrick Harold, our moderator for the session today, and amongst his many responsibilities, is the co-founder and co-lead of BCG's Center for Climate and Sustainability, with a focus on green technologies and decarbonization. He is also a long-term core member of BCG's energy operations and strategy practices. He is an expert in climate change topics, including abatement levers and their economics, markets and emissions regulations, and related strategies for private and public sector organization. I would like to now invite on stage our moderator for the session, Dr. Patrick Harold, Managing Director and Partner, Co-founder and Co-lead of BCG's Center for Climate and Sustainability. Thank you.
So, welcome to this afternoon session. It is with great pleasure that I'm here. Not only is it an exciting topic, clean and green energy transition, but also I'm accompanied with a great set of colleagues and speakers that will run the panel with us this afternoon. And so please join me in welcoming them. And may I ask you on stage. First one, Olivier Sorel, our VP of Chemicals and Hydrogen at Saudi Aramco. And let's give him an applause and a welcome. Second, Engineer Fahad Al-Lajan, President of KAPSARC. Third, Terasawa-san, Chairman and CEO at the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan. Fourth, Doug Kelly, President of Technology at KPR. And fifth, Al-Muthir Al-Karouzi, Chief Executive for Strategy and Transformation at OQ. So welcome, gentlemen. And I now have the pleasure of teasing us a little bit and setting the stage for this discussion to come before we then embark on the panel discussion. There are powerful drivers at work globally in the energy sectors, but I would say so for the next years, even more so for the chemicals and petchem sectors. And most of them are actually related to the energy transition and the green energy opportunity, and yes, in many regards, also challenges. So let me put some of them on stage. The first one in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act. It was commented on earlier. Literally overnight, the US was catapulted to be the pioneer of clean energy, both from an electricity side, solar, wind onshore, wind offshore, but likewise from a hydrogen side, again, energy and feedstock alike. And what you see here is the cost reduction on the production side that the IRA is facilitating. 50 to 75% lower production cost for green electricity and hydrogen in the blue and green colors as a result of the IRA. Close to 400 billion of investment subsidy volumes recognized and reserved between now and 2032. So this is for the next decade to come. And literally, again, overnight, the US is at the forefront of the green energy revolution and evolution, we should say. Second powerful driver of change. There's a thing called the energy crisis, which in particular Europe has been hit very, very strongly, and which gives a significant cost advantage by comparison for the Gulf country states here in the Middle East. What you see here is a BCG scenario that we are developing on energy prices for gas, power, and also CO2 as a projection for the next decade to come. And what you see, for an example, KSA here in Saudi, the cheapest source of gas and power costs compared to some of the global competitors, if you may say so, in the US, China, and definitely here Germany as an example for Central Europe, which literally has turned things around over the last 8 months. Third driver of change, and it's not going to go away, it's just going to get harder and tougher and be even more and more on stage, is the emissions crisis, the climate challenge that we are all facing. Coming out of COP27, I was there for a few days, seeing the negotiations, how tough they were. We are still projecting an increase of global emissions by 11% by 2030, whereas the world would need to see, depending on the scenario and path you believe in, a reduction of 43%. So we yet need to manage a turnaround in the global emissions, and we need to do this at a pace that we've seen only once before. Once in the COVID year, 2020, the world has seen an emission reduction versus a prior year of 4 to 5 to 6%, depending on the statistics you look at. And this is the annual reduction of emissions that we would need in order to be compliant with a 1.5 degree path. Huge ambition, and some of us might challenge whether that's actually feasible, but that's what science and Paris are saying. Technology is not so much the problem. The emission reduction levers, keeping it simple here for a second, are largely known, starting obviously demand management, circularity, all the efficiency levers. We are running many efficiency programs that get significant momentum from a carbon reduction side, all of them with a positive business case. But the more you move to the right, the tougher the levers become, not just from an economic, or not least from an economic perspective, as the abatement costs for low carbon hydrogen, carbon capture, and use and storage are still significantly higher. And so indeed, it is a business case challenge for the moment. What you see here on this rather complex slide is the cost premium, as of today, as we speak, of some of the key decarbonization technologies applied to some of the key fundamental products and goods that we all need so much. Energy, I mentioned it in the beginning. Obviously, renewable electricity has been in the money for the past years in many parts of the region. Solar and wind are just cheaper than coal, nuclear, etc. But many of the other input goods, plastics, ammonia here to quote, are still significantly, in many cases, double to triple-digit percentages higher than their fossil alternative. And obviously, that's the key hurdle that we need to overcome. The good news is, obviously, we all know about cost regression, about technology progress, that will gradually, as these technologies scale, as there will be feed-in tariffs, other investment schemes, that these yellowish and reddish bars will move to the left, become green more and more, making them more and more in the money. The real truth is that obviously that this will happen much faster than what we've seen over the last years. If you look back in history, we have always been wrong in predicting the pace of change and in predicting the progress, in particular, of green technologies. What you see here is not a projection in the future, it's the history, which you can very accurately measure. And just let's look at the top left-hand side of that chart. It's the projection for the installed capacity of solar photovoltaics at a global level. The projection for 2030, between 2002 and 2020, has increased by a factor of 36. So in all our scenarios, in all our consensus thinking that we had, by a minimum of factor 36, we had to upward correct the estimation of the installed global photovoltaic capacity. And that's, of course, closely related to what's at the bottom of the part, mainly the cost reduction that went much faster than many of us would have thought. And this holds for wind, for batteries, and the assumption, and in a way also the hope, is to say, obviously, this will also hold for other green technologies. We will talk about electrolyzers, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So that's my personal hope, that this technology progress will significantly accelerate and ultimately provide much more meaningful business cases for these technologies that we are talking so much about. There is a market momentum that goes beyond technology and beyond individual business cases. And this is a slide that I'm sharing here for the first time. We will publish this jointly with the World Economic Forum. It spans across many different sectors. And what does it basically say? It says, for the 7 biggest emitting supply chains that we have, automotive, food, households, etc., the commitments that companies have made on the downstream side in terms of decarbonization are significantly bigger and more ambitious than the companies on the upstream side of those value chains. To make an example, in the very first line, automakers, BMW, Toyota, Ford, etc. 24% of the market is covered by significant SBTi-aligned decarbonization targets, basically aligned with 1.5 degree paths. Now, to make a car net zero, it's not just about going to electrification, which most of these vendors do have, but they will need to make it net zero from their input products, steel, plastic, chemicals, batteries, all of which goes into a car. But what you see when you analyze the big companies that are listed out there that have disclosed what their ambition level is, it's significantly lower. So you see on the top left-hand side, mining, steel, aluminum, plastic, largely single-digit percentages of shares of emissions commitments by these players versus a much bigger commitment by the likes of BMW, etc. And what we are currently witnessing across all of these sectors is that this decarbonization pressure is rippling upwards. BMW, when their CEO made an announcement almost 1.5 years ago, that going forward, their providers of steel, plastic, chemicals, batteries, etc., would not only be awarded in terms of quality and price, but also by carbon content. That triggered itself a huge decarbonization effort for the tier 1 automotive suppliers. In the steel industry, if today you want to buy green steel, you won't get it. There's scarcity and significant price premium. You can't buy green steel between now and 2026 because the market is basically sold empty because of all these car makers' commitments. And then you go step by step through all these other value chains and you just recognize that this is a game to unfold over the next years. Within steel, this happened within 18 months. We're actually seeing signs of scarcity and hence increasing prices. We are talking of green premiums or green premia for some of these decarbonized or lower carbon products. Steel on the right-hand side, which I've mentioned, that's very hard and that's very robustly measurable as we speak, with significant price premiums achievable. ArcelorMittal charging 200 euros per ton of markup for green steel, and similarly others. And the more we move to the left-hand side, the more we see this starting. Obviously, plastic here very, very relevant for us. This is a huge opportunity coming up. Steel was an industry, and I'm using intentionally this as an analogy here for chemicals, that for decades was just based on commodity competition, very low margins. It was a buyer's market. But all of a sudden, steelmakers can and should think about strategic pricing around where to sell their green steel, where can I earn the biggest margin for this, which industry is the one that has the biggest pressure. In this case, it was automotive. And when we put it all together, when we do the detailed analysis around what are the commitments by downstream types of players versus what are the announcements and the investment activity that we are seeing on the upstream side, you can, in a way, predict that there will be scarcity in additional sectors. This is a projection for 2030, obviously a highly dynamic picture. You will need to place assumptions. But it's not very hard to argue that plastics and chemicals, a few years from now, will be very scarce in terms of the green supply, meaning a huge business opportunity for price premium, very, very similar to what we are seeing right now in green steel. Let me zoom in hydrogen, a second theme of our discussion today, very, very briefly. Obviously, the question is not will hydrogen grow, but just how fast. The key driver, this is obviously the level of decarbonization that we seek to achieve. In our scenarios, the more ambitious you are, i.e. moving to a 1.5 degree global path, the earlier and the steeper you see this demand rising. And for a stated policy scenario where the world would basically be in the state as it is today, the demand for low carbon hydrogen, blue, green, many other colors would roughly stagnate over the next years to come. Significant investment volumes expected. Most of you would know that, between 3 and 10 trillion of investment by 2050 cumulatively. The interesting thing of these numbers is not so much the trillions as such, but it is where does this investment go. And what these charts actually are showing, a less ambitious scenario on the left hand and a more ambitious scenario on the right hand side, is that a significant part of the investment will go into end-use technologies, fuel cells, hydrogen-fired turbines in power plants, etc. And only a smaller part than what's actually commonly known goes into the actual production of hydrogen, electrolyzers, capture facilities to produce blue hydrogen, etc. And another part will obviously need to go into the infrastructure to make the hydrogen economy scale as such. The Middle East is in a very strong place for this. We've seen some of the biggest announcements on hydrogen over the last years. Saudi Aramco, Aqua, together with PRF, very active in the kingdom. First shipments of blue hydrogen to Japan already quite some time ago. UAE with a significant and huge ambition, obviously, to target 25% of the global low carbon hydrogen export market for the next 7 to 8 years. And similarly, Oman, and you could continue with this. So worldwide, quite a recognized region to be a leader. This was pre-IRA in the US, of course. It's also part of the truth that not a lot actually has happened beyond announcements, if I were to be a little bit provocative. This is an industry in the very, very early stages. When we look at our project database that we are tracking, we are counting 1,400 total announced projects in hydrogen. Only 200 of them are actually completed and in operation. Many of them in pilot in an early stage, only very few of them being at scale and in commercial operation. But obviously we see a significant pipeline here on the left, and let's hope that many, many of them would make it through the funnel to actually investment decisions over the next months and years. I would want to close with one food for thought, given that many company representatives are here. What's the best way of making business out of this green transition opportunity, with all the uncertainties, with all the challenges that are in there? Again, quoting the study and the report that we've developed with many CEOs across many sectors, we will publish this in January together with the forum in Davos. 6 elements to watch out for. Number 1, design your target portfolio. Sounds pretty technical. It's nothing but to think through what would your product and business portfolio look like for a decarbonized world. This will take 2 decades to come, but what's your understanding of the world? Where will your business be in a decade, 2 decades from now? What kind of products will you sell that are not fossil energy based, or at least not related to emissions? Then steps 2, 3, and 4 are about laying out a go-to-market strategy. Step 2, identifying what's your green value proposition. Is it a low share of carbon? Is it a recyclability that you offer to your end customer? Is it anything else? And there's a range of opportunities, not just about carbon. And that leads to number 3. There's huge uncertainty today what your customers would actually buy. So you need to engage with them much, much more than you do today in a pretty much commodity and standardized market. You will need to reach out, you will need to pivot, there will be failures. This is how some of the first pioneers have become successful. And then obviously going back to the steel example that I mentioned earlier, when there is such a scarcity in the market, and it should happen what I predicted, then obviously it's about being very, very smart in terms of market share discovery and in terms of pricing of the rare green products that will be out there. Number 5, not a secret, partnership is the new leadership, in particular in this space, sharing risks, sharing investments, creating demand along the value chain with companies that you may not have traditionally partnered for. And ultimately, number 6, let's of course recognize this is a huge transformation challenge. This may have put actually more questions than answers at this stage, which was very much the intention of the teaser, and now it gives me big, big pleasure to listen from some of the practitioners in the industry. And I would want to invite every one of my colleagues to give a short statement on how they see the challenges and the opportunities in the green energy transition. And maybe, Olivier, first word to you.
Yeah, I like to call that the energy transition without putting a color on it. But that being said, it is a massive challenge that the world has to undertake over the next decades. I personally think there is no other outcome that successfully managing a transition, and that will entail to balance on the energy side the affordability and the availability, as well as the carbon intensity of the energy we use and the product we use, generally speaking. Now, what it means for the chemical industry in this region is actually a tremendous opportunity. Because if you look at the ingredients that are needed to produce and actually market low carbon solutions and low carbon products for our customers, and you look at the cocktail of things we have to do, well, obviously you have to drive energy efficiency with the best technologies, and to a large extent this industry was built relatively recently. So we don't have old plants which are inefficient to deal with. To a large extent, we have a really strong base to start from. we can improve, and everything we'll build from there in terms of growth would be best in class in terms of technology. We look into electrification through renewable electricity, and no question that the kingdom, but also the region here, has tremendous opportunities in solar, but also wind. So the ability to harness that is not only for hydrogen, by the way, it's actually for the electrification and the lowering the carbon intensity of the electric system. So that's a really big lever for which we have competitive advantage in the region. We look at carbon sequestration, which everyone recognizes is an essential tool to enable the carbon circular economy, carbon management, and the geology that is so conducive to large reservoir of hydrocarbons in terms of porosity, and there is exactly conducive to storing carbon as well. So what we discover with the project we are leading right now in the kingdom is that we can, on the back of the Eastern Province and the Juba Industrial City, develop a very large scale multi-phase carbon sequestration solution for the industry, up to 40 million tons of CO2 per year, with the first phase in a few years' time at 9 million tons per year. This makes it one of the largest and most effective way to store carbon permanently. So you look at that, and I could even go in terms of the overall circularity of plastics, as the waste management system are rapidly changing in the region here, moving from the landfill majority to have much more elaborate waste management system. The kingdom is mandating 95% of the waste needs to be properly and have a proper end-of-life solution that will create raw materials for a circular economy. But also, if you think about closing the plastic waste leakage back into chemical recycling, we just bring these feedstocks here and we can process them in our facility, existing facility, whether it's refining or chemicals. So I think all those advantages, when you put them on there, combined with the existing competitive advantage of a very ample, predictable resource base for hydrocarbons, and by the way, let's remember that most of the chemical product that will be produced in 2050 will use hydrocarbon feedstock as a backbone. That creates, I think, a tremendous opportunity, and I believe that region will have more competitive advantage moving forward than they have today in being able to meet all the requirements a customer will have in terms of low carbon solutions.
Fahad.
Thank you. First, maybe just let me say a few words about KAPSARC. So King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center is a non-profit think tank that focuses on energy and sustainability. I would like maybe to add to what Olivier discussed and maybe talk about the global context and then zoom into the GCC context. In COP26, I would say that I was very pessimistic about the energy transition. And for me, it was more about having two distinct conversations and nobody was listening. And it was two different paths. And I don't think there was a middle path that everybody was committing to. And I think that has changed significantly in the last year. I think the Ukraine conflict has brought into context, I think, issues of energy security and energy affordability, and I think we're now more on a more pragmatic path. I think while there has been maybe we backtracked a little bit in 2022, I think the future is actually much more, I'm very optimistic about that, and I think targets are now being actually more realistic. I think targets are actually more ambitious, and I think we've seen this globally with the policy that have been, and especially with the Inflation Reduction Act. And so it gives me more optimism going forward that actually the energy transition is going to be an opportunity. It's a challenge, but there is an opportunity. However, I think the opportunity is not global. And I think there will be winners and there will be losers, unfortunately. It's not how we would like it to be, and I think that's why it's important what happened in COP27 around loss and damage, about the climate finance, the $100 billion pledge by advanced economy to help developing economies are essential. However, there will be, unfortunately, winners and losers. And I think I see personally the US, especially after the Inflation Reduction Act, all the investment that is heading there, and the discussion around technology and investment is going to be one winner. But I think the second winner is actually the Middle East, and specifically the GCC. I think, just to add to what Olivier mentioned around the announcement by Saudi Aramco around the biggest, largest CCU hub in Jubail, not only the 44 million tons, because I think that's exciting, but I am impressed actually by the 9 million ton in 2027. 2027 is tomorrow. It's not in actually 5 years. In practical speaking, in projects, that's happening tomorrow. And so I'm very excited by this. I think in the GCC, we see, the ability first to invest in long-term projects. I think this happened, and the petrochemical industry is a prime example of that, happening in the 70s and 80s around treating associated gas and creating value out of this. And I think the government, but also the private player, have this long-term vision and long-term outlook where they can afford to invest. I think another opportunity that we're not thinking about, and I think this is what we are not seeing, is the discussion around the global supply chain. I think there was a big change in the global supply chain in the 70s and 80s with a lot of industrial production moving out of Europe, moving out of advanced economy, and part of it was because of the availability and advantage of cheaper labor. I think the availability of cheap and clean energy is going to be important, and we're going to see a reconfiguration of the supply chain in countries that will be able to provide cheaper, clean energy, but also ways to decarbonize. And some countries are just naturally blessed, ability to generate cheap wind, cheap solar, but also the ability to sequester carbon, give them an advantage. And I think it's very important, and I think we will definitely see opportunities not only in exporting those forms of energy, but I think in reconfiguring the supply chain, and I think capturing more of the value add within the GCC. I mean, looking at the announcement and what you discussed, not only in Saudi and UAE, but also in Oman and Qatar and others, I think it's a huge change. It's a challenge and opportunity, but I think the GCC is probably one of the biggest winners if they implement and follow up on their investment and their vision.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me focus on hydrogen. Japan was probably the first country in the world focusing on the potential for hydrogen. 4 years ago, Japan hosted the first international ministerial meeting on hydrogen. And at the time, I was the vice minister for work for the Japanese government. And I clearly recall that when I talked with my European friends, like in Brussels or London or Berlin, the response was very modest at the time. And now people are talking about hydrogen. Wherever I go, hydrogen is the topic. But please ask yourselves, when did you really start talking about hydrogen seriously? Was it 4 years ago? Fahad, you're ahead of KAPSARC. You must have been thinking about that. But probably not. So it's a very recent history. But it's quite impressive, the speed at which people are talking about hydrogen. So there should be a rationale for the necessity of hydrogen. So probably sharing with you why Japan has been attaching great importance to hydrogen might be of some value. The first reason is about the hard-to-abate sectors, like the industrial sectors or the transportation sectors. These sectors are hard to electrify, so very difficult to decarbonize these sectors. To decarbonize these hard-to-abate sectors, like the industrial sectors or the transportation sectors, hydrogen can play a very important role. Hydrogen can generate high-temperature heat, which will be essential for the industrial policy. Hydrogen can be used to produce steel. Steel industry was one of the most problematic CO2 emitter. So to enable producing steel using hydrogen without emitting CO2 would be a great advantage. And also, hydrogen can be used to produce synthesized fuel to support the transportation, such like the airline industry. People like to electrify everything, but I will refuse to get on an airplane running on batteries. I don't want to be told up in the air that, sorry, the battery is lost. So that is another reason why synthesized fuel produced from hydrogen is very important. And since Japan has a very strong manufacturing sector, it is natural that Japan attaches great importance to hydrogen. And Japan has the technology to deal with various aspects of hydrogen. The second reason is about renewable energies. We would love to use more renewable energies, but unfortunately, Japan is a small island nation, and 70% of our land is mountains. So in the remaining 30% flat land, 120 million people live. I envy of Saudi Arabia. So it makes the installation of solar panel very challenging in Japan. And we have lots of rain. We envy Saudi Arabia for not having rain. You might be surprised. And also, you may ask, oh, Japan is an island nation, but Japan is surrounded by oceans, seas. Why not having offshore wind power generation? It's possible, but the problem is that the seas surrounding Japan go deep right away. So the typical bottom fixed type offshore wind power generation you see in the North Sea will not be possible to be deployed in Japan unless the floating type offshore wind power generation is widely used. Our potential for renewable energies will be limited. So if we cannot have our domestic renewable energies, we would have to import renewable energy somehow. But unfortunately, Japan, Korea, or Taiwan, these countries in the Northeast Asia do not have transmission connection with other countries. So the only way to import renewable energies is through hydrogen. Produce hydrogen from water using electrolyzer and using the power generated from renewable energies to produce hydrogen, and then import that hydrogen to Japan. This is an indirect way of importing renewable energies. Saudi Arabia is rich in renewable energies, especially solar power. Through green hydrogen, we can have renewable energies to be used in Japan. That's the second reason. The third reason is the intermittency of renewable energies. Some people would argue that having solar panels and wind power will resolve everything. But it's not true. These renewable energies have intermittency. The power generation goes ups and down. But to have the stability of power system, you need to have the balance of demand and supply. So when you have intermittency, you need to have offsetting dispatchable power. Some people would talk about, well, batteries would be the solution. But batteries would be a partial solution. They're very expensive, and the duration of power storage is very limited, and it would consume a lot of critical minerals. We talk about the sustainability of our atmosphere, but we have to think about the sustainability of our critical minerals. So in that regard, in addition to batteries, low carbon thermal power will be very important to stabilize the power system. In that regard, hydrogen can be used to produce low carbon thermal power, which will be essential. So it's not choosing renewable energies or hydrogen. In order to have renewable energies, we need to have low carbon thermal power generation using hydrogen. So now you see the various reasons why Japan was so excited about hydrogen, and probably we were right, because the excitement is spreading around globally. But there are challenges. There are a number of challenges, but the number one challenge I would stress at this opening speech is the transportation of hydrogen. If you had pipelines, you could transport hydrogen. But once again, unfortunately, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, they are not connected with other countries with pipelines. So you have to carry hydrogen using vessels. But hydrogen as gas is so much voluminous, so you have to liquefy hydrogen. But in order to liquefy hydrogen, you have to cool it down to minus 253 degrees Celsius. And some might argue that, well, we did it with LNG, but that's only minus 161 degrees. To get from minus 161 to minus 253, it is very expensive. It's possible, but very difficult. We have been exploring other channels for transportation as carriers. We have explored MCH, combining toluene with hydrogen, and sending MCH to Japan and converting back to hydrogen. We have also explored ammonia, changing hydrogen into ammonia, carrying ammonia to Japan, and then converting back to hydrogen. The beauty of both MCH and ammonia is that you don't have to cool it to that low. For ammonia, only minus 33 degrees Celsius, and it becomes liquid. So it's very, very much less expensive to use ammonia or MCH as a carrier. And we have conducted some research on the cost of transportation, and it's clear that compared with liquefied hydrogen, MCH or ammonia would be much cheaper to transport hydrogen to Japan. In particular for ammonia, there's another benefit. Ammonia can be used as fuel. You don't have to convert it back to hydrogen if you are to use it as fuel. So if the step of converting ammonia back to hydrogen, if you can skip it, the cost of ammonia will be much cheaper. So we find using ammonia as a fuel will be the first step in utilizing hydrogen and its derivatives. And in fact, in Japan, we still have a large fleet of coal-fired power plants in Japan. And you may ask why Japan having coal-fired power plants. The simple answer is that after the Fukushima nuclear accident, we stopped all the nuclear power generation in Japan, so we had to scramble to build new coal-fired power plants. And we cannot give away, retire them early. So we have to continue using those coal-fired power plants, but at the same time reducing the CO2 emission from those coal-fired power plants.
And
ammonia can...
And that's an aspect we would very much want to drill down then a bit later, right? And maybe for now we can move forward.
Okay, maybe I need to have additional time.
Yes.
Okay, I'll stop.
Excellent.
So,
thank you so much. No, we will deep dive on this later. Doug, over to you.
okay.
Yeah, we'll go deeper in that, I'm sure. So
Talk about ammonia.
one thing that's been obvious from the comments this morning and the comments that have been made so far on this panel is that energy transition means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For some, it means just decarbonization. For some, it means ammonia, very serious, significant piece. For some, it means biofuels, biochemicals. For some, it means carbon sequestration, utilization, storage. I think that if you look at a global perspective, all of these are going to play some role. And the question really is, which are going to play the most significant role, which are going to be the most cost competitive, which can we roll out, today in the most way. And one of the areas I do think about, and I'm glad I came after you, is we feel like ammonia is going to be a significant player in the short term because the technology exists, the ability to produce blue ammonia, which is a lower carbon footprint ammonia, to be used for all the reasons that you stated below, is something that can be done today, and it can be done relatively inexpensively. There's a lot of talk about green ammonia and green hydrogen in the press, but the reality is it's still very, very expensive. Dr. Patrick, on your slide, you showed the relative cost of blue and green hydrogen and green ammonia, and there's a significant difference there still. And so we think that we see tremendous amounts of development, tremendous amounts of innovation going on in that space, but if you want to get started and make a difference today, it's largely around blue ammonia. There's other areas that we also look at, the plastics recycling, which we're going to go into some more details here in a minute. There's some challenges with that, but also some opportunities there. So the bottom line is energy transition is very complex. That's why we're talking about it today. I don't think any one person has the answer, which is really my second point, is that solving the challenges of energy transition, it's a team sport. It's not going to be just operating companies to deal with this problem. It's going to be operating companies, technology companies, think tanks, private equity, banks, financing, governments, all working together, putting policies together that align with what's doable today. Like the U.S., the IRA passing is incentive. It's the carrot, if you will, to producing some new innovations and new technologies and new approaches. But I think the other thing is, the other word I like to use is balance. It is a transition. We are where we are. There's a lot of hydrocarbon fuels, a lot of hydrocarbons in the mix, especially in GCC countries. And so we can't forget about the traditional technologies, the operating plants that are here in the GCC today. I think the challenge that we have there is how can we lower the carbon footprint? How can we reduce energies from the traditional technologies that are out there today through more efficient catalysts, through optimization, through removing stages of compression, through optimum processes. So it's a really balance between how do we go from where we are to where we need to go. And the reality is those traditional technologies and those traditional operating plants are going to fund the innovation and the technology change that are needed going forward. And then I think finally what I would say is I try not to lose sight personally for why are we talking about all this? Why are we doing this? And ultimately is all the things we're talking about are making this world a cleaner, more environmentally friendly place for ourselves, for our kids, and for our grandkids. So personally in my career, I want to do something that matters. I want to participate in something that makes a difference, not only for myself, but also my kids and my grandkids. And so that's why I'm excited about the innovation, the technology developments, the forum that's been created here by GPCA so we can share ideas, because no one person, no one company is going to have the answer, but it's through the sharing of ideas that we're doing here today that are going to make the difference. So that's it. Please.
Thanks. I think the problem with speaking last is everybody said everything you wanted to say. But I'm going to try to be the devil's advocate today, and I'm going to talk about experiences that we face ourselves in our journey as OQ to decarbonize and to move towards a green future. First, I think I agree with what my colleagues have said. The Middle East is the perfect place to start off with a green future. Yeah? We have the oil and gas resources to talk about, which we can use, decarbonize and use blue. We have abundant sun, and in some places also abundant wind, which gives you the perfect environment to get the lowest cost of hydrogen production. These are all great things. When you look at the flip side, when you talk about decarbonization, I mean, this morning, Nasser talked about how we'll have 10 billion people by 2050. If you look at the energy demand, if you look at the issue of energy security, it's just mind-boggling. I actually looked at it and a number of times, and I saw how energy demand has soared quite significantly in the last 20, 30 years. And it's going to keep going up because populations are increasing, standard of living is going up, more and more we're using technology. So if we start at that point, yes, maybe we have a chance to decarbonize, but I think at the rate of acceleration of energy requirements, it's going to be very hard because we even talk about coal. That's something we still use today, and we continue to use even more. Yeah, so that's not going to go away. So I do believe, yes, decarbonizing our oil and gas resources is something that's very important because the energy security, the energy demand is going to need it. When you come to look at chemical plants decarbonization, we've actually looked at this at OQ, and we put a tag of between $3 billion of CapEx, $1 billion of OpEx to get this done. And if you're looking at marginal businesses that are generating just your oil margin, and we saw again in today's presentation how the market is cyclical, prices are dropping, you have to think about how do I fund this decarbonization? And you can ask your upstream to pay for your downstream, but at the end of the day, you're losing out. And then the second question you ask is, what is the value of these decarbonized or these blue materials? I know you've shown some charts, but trust me, when you go out to the market and you ask people, nobody's willing to pay that. They always ask you, what's it going to cost you? And then they tell you, well, okay, I'll pay a bit more than that. So where's the value proposition coming from that? Hydrogen is something I do believe will be the future fuel with ammonia as well. Also, we've looked at it and we said this seems to be the best thing. Oman is going to spend about $190 billion between now and 2050 to generate a significant amount of renewable energies and green ammonia. But hydrogen also has its issues. I mean, you talked about generating heat from hydrogen. The round-trip efficiency of hydrogen is very, very low. And you compare it to hydro or other renewable fuels, it's not that good, yeah? So I think technology is what will play a major role with respect to how fast we decarbonize, how fast we can realize the benefits of the green economy. And I looked at a paper from Bill Gates who said if we had spent $5 billion between 1980 and 1990, the cost of reduction in photovoltaics would have been 10 years earlier. Today we have that investment happening, as you mentioned, and I think that's going to be the key to making sure we can realize this carbon-free dream. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Look, we've talked a lot about the energy transition and clean energy opportunities more broadly. Now let's zoom a little bit into the chemicals and petrochemicals sector and the implications of the transition on these sectors. Maybe Doug, Olivier, hearing from you first, right? Picking on the theme of winners and losers that we had before. Like, what would you see as the biggest upsides and downsides, maybe challenges and risks for the chemicals and petchem sectors in this context?
I like the comment saying that in the end, there won't be a silver bullet. It's a mix of solutions that will help provide this low carbon solution, this lower carbon footprint products. Just focus on what we're good at, right? So, you know, agricultural waste is not in the region. We all agree on that. So that won't be a competitive advantage. What we have is longevity of hydrocarbon resources, predictability around that. We have, by the way, the lowest carbon intensity hydrocarbons you can get in the world in this region. So you get that scope 3 benefit on what you buy and you use. We mentioned about being able to use hydrogen and decarbonize electricity to manage your scope 1 and 2 emissions. So in the end, you end up making the best possible petrochemical building block, whether it's a polymer or whether it's an industrial product, with the lowest carbon intensity you have, and then it's up to your customers to use that in the best possible way. And so these benefits are real, and that's what we have to focus on. And we will get real competitive advantage from that. I also believe that as we closed from so you think about mechanical recycling probably happens where the polymers can be connected, but chemical recycling is again a value chain that can really work at a globalized level, where we get the pie oil back into the plants we have today to efficiently process it, again with the right scope 1 and 2, to produce these circular polymers. So these are, I think, the business models that the companies here will focus on, but also we have the ability to attract investors and partners, as was mentioned this morning, in this region, so that these companies can provide the product their customer demand.
Yeah, I think from an upside standpoint, it goes back to a conversation, Olivia, you and I were having backstage around what happens if we're only 80% of the way to net zero. I think, you know, moving in the right direction and making a difference will make a difference in, you know, climate change. And so I think that's really the upside, is that you know, these projects, the topics that we're talking about really will make a difference. I think the challenge is, and everyone's alluded to it, you know, it's not for free. You know, innovation, technology, collaboration requires an investment from all of the areas I talked about before, operating companies, technology companies, banks, financing, all working together. And I think, you know, it's that cost. And I think the third thing that might be the biggest challenge is it's time to act. You know, we need to move quickly to make a difference by the timelines that we've all agreed to.
Fahad, we talked about sort of the Middle East being in a very strong starting position, right? From your perspective at KAPSARC, building on the theme, right? It's time to act. Yes, it's expensive. There is upfront investment needed. But is there any specific view on Saudi, on Middle East more broadly, where you would say this is where we can pioneer?
Sure. I just wanted to add one thing on the opportunities and the challenges. And I think I would like to expand on what my friend Terazawa-san mentioned, that we're looking only at a fragmented part of sustainability, which is CO2 emissions. And I think, yes, that's important, but it shouldn't be the only factor, because we're going to drive investment, or we're going to drive emissions in other sectors, and it's very important. He talked about critical mining and minerals, but I just wanted to talk about plastic. I think we're having a misconception and a perception about, you know, plastic, that plastics are a polluting material, and it's actually quite the opposite. If you look at the sustainability of plastic, I would say plastic is probably one of the most sustainable material when you're looking at in terms of CO2 emissions, but in other terms as well, energy use, water use, and other metrics for sustainability. I know today we have these, you know, glass bottle, and it's being served in a lot of, you know, conferences and places because people think that actually glass is more sustainable than plastic. It's actually not true. And we need to look at these things and look at life cycle, you know, cost, life cycle emission, but life cycle sustainability. It's not KAPSARC is saying this, you know, the Danish environmental department actually had a study around, you know, the issue of plastic bag and the ban around plastic bag. And we've seen that actually when you ban, you know, single-use plastic, actually plastic consumption goes up. which is counterintuitive. But it's very important that when we think about sustainability, we don't only look at visibility. The problem with plastic is that plastic pollution is visible. And so for me, that's something that should be addressed around, plastic recycling, all the mandates that we have. But banning plastic or replacing it with less sustainable material just because it looks better is actually not a smart decision. On the opportunities and challenges, I think within Saudi, the investment, which is the first part of the that is needed to meet the 2030 NDCs, the nationally determined contribution for Saudi Arabia is about $180 billion, and that's not including items such as modification to the grid to incorporate renewable energies and other. So the price tag is not insignificant. It's actually critical, and as you go forward, you're going to have the cost of removal or the cost of abating an additional CO2, ton of CO2 is going to increase further and further. Yes, it is lower than other parts of the world, but we're talking about significant investment. In our analysis, if you want to achieve, Saudi is targeting net zero by 2060, we're talking about between $300 and $600 billion in investment just related to decarbonization and investment in renewable. And so that is, and we're talking about today's money, and so that if you multiply it or you imply inflation, it's going to be much, much bigger than that. And so it's not an easy challenge. When we look at it globally, we're talking about $2 to $8 trillion annually for the global energy transition. We're seeing that spending happening in the US, in the EU, in China, maybe in the GCC. Other parts of the world cannot do that. And so it's very important that we actually focus on that.
Do you see the IRA in the US as a burden or as a blessing from a Middle East perspective? Like, is there a competition, or do you say, well, that's what's needed to kick off the industry even further?
I think it's healthy competition.
Yeah.
I think competition is healthy. I mean, we've seen what happened with solar. We've seen what happened with battery cost. These drive innovation and everybody benefits. So I think it's healthy competition. I like what is happening with the IRA. I like what is happening with the announcement by Saudi Aramco for CCUS, because everybody will learn but also benefits from lower cost of CO2 abatement and lower cost of technology.
Terasawa-san, you talked about Japan, right? And about the hydrogen import, the ammonia opportunity. Are things moving fast enough from a Japanese? Are things moving fast enough from a Japanese perspective?
Well, the problem is that there's so much attention in Japan about hydrogen, just as we are talking about hydrogen. But the biggest challenge is to ensure that there is a guaranteed market. I can touch upon the history of LNG because Japan was the pioneer in the development of the LNG supply chain. And actually, the first cargo of LNG arrived in Japan in 1969, 50 years ago. And why was it possible was because the power industry and the city gas industry, the users of LNG, were heavily regulated at the time, and they had a guaranteed rate of return. So those companies, the power companies and city gas companies, could make a long-term commitment to buy LNG even if they may be more expensive than the other fossil fuel, because it was considered that LNG was cleaner to deal with the air pollution problem, which was serious in Japan. So there is some relevance, a similarity between the LNG and today, but there's a difference. At the time, there was a regulated industry with guaranteed rate of return, but we have liberalized our markets, not just in Japan, but in many countries, they have liberalized the power market and the city gas markets. So there's no guaranteed return for the investment available. So hydrogen ammonia is relatively more expensive. So how can we ensure that there will be an ultimate demand, an off-taker? And that's the biggest challenge. And we cannot go back to the age in which we have a totally fully regulated industries. We cannot go back. So what we have to do is introduce an alternative policy framework to ensure that the power companies or the city gas companies will be making the commitment to buy hydrogen ammonia, even though they might be more expensive, by having the policy filling that gap. We don't have that framework in place, but we are in serious discussion to having that kind of framework. And in the absence of those frameworks, in the absence of guaranteed demand, all the talks we're having about hydrogen will be just ending with talks. So what is important first of all, is having that kind of guaranteed demand in place. And that will require a policy involvement.
Yeah, so yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. I did mention that a lot of times, and if you see it also with the number of announced projects, which are quite significant, but the number of FID'd hydrogen projects, they're very, very low, is that you don't have that long-term off-taker who's willing to pay the prices of the higher hydrogen, green hydrogen costs. I think we always look at technology. Again, I'll come back to technology. And I've been told that by 2030, or at least all the research says, you'll have a price parity between grey hydrogen and green hydrogen. And that, I think, will delay all these projects because everybody's waiting to either get the right price or get the right customer. And if we don't have governments implementing policies that incentivize these kind of contracts, like the IRA does for the US, then we're not going to have these projects taking off, at least what I don't see them taking off anytime soon, honestly.
No, I fully, yeah.
Can I add one point? Going back to the history of LNG, Japan was the single country pulling the LNG market for a few decades, followed by Korea and Taiwan, then by China. And by ensuring that we had a large enough scale, the cost went down. So now the LNG market is very efficient, but it took 50 years to get to where we are. For hydrogen ammonia, we cannot afford to wait for another 50 years to realize what we have with LNG. We have to do it in a much faster way. How we can make it happen is not just by a single country pulling the whole weight. As Doug said, it has to be a teamwork. Many countries, consumers, producers, many companies getting together in a coordinated manner to realize the scale and realize the speed. That is essential to repeat the history of LNG, which was very successful, but in a much faster way.
Let me link it to one question that we've received from the audience. Olivier, directed to you, but also, Murthy, I would want to invite also your perspective, right, from OQ. How can SABIC, Aramco, and I would want to add OQ, contribute to hydrogen market development in the GCC? We talked about securing demand. We've talked about the IRA as a production side incentive mechanism. So what can large companies here in the country, here in the region do to shape the market?
Yeah, so I think the market is supply and demand. So I think if I look on the supply side, we really teamed up with SABIC to develop a very large hydrogen export hub. We talk about 1 BCF of gas, 15 million tons of CO2 captured, 10 million tons of ammonia. And that can only happen with demand partners. And actually to move we believe that scale we're able to get the cost down, but also to get the logistics right. So this product will have to move in very large ammonia carriers that don't exist today. These ammonia carriers will have to be ammonia fueled because otherwise you emit CO2 you're trying to save. And the infrastructure that needs to receive these tankers don't exist today. And if you want to convert that ammonia into hydrogen to be used in the steel sector and so on, you need to invest in the backcracking infrastructure that will enable that to be happening. So there is a real value chain development to be done. Our job is to project that vision. We engage with a number of demand owners and countries to develop that together. And it's our start also to be quite transparent and clear about what can we achieve from a carbon intensity standpoint. So that we can also have the policy makers tuning their policies to someone which is also achievable, but not too easily achievable because otherwise you don't really solve the issue. So that's happening right now. I think on the demand side, in the GCC, we are also, Aramco and SABIC combined, large user of hydrogen, and all our chemical and especially the crude to chemical growth will rely on hydrotreating. So desulfurization, hydrogening, we use massive amount of hydrogen, and our plants will be designed to use low carbon hydrogen from the onset. So you create then a local demand for hydrogen that can be used. So it means pipeline infrastructure, it means plants, it means carbon sequestration that can be used to also enable smaller users to use that molecule as well to proceed with their own decarbonization, whether it's a steel plant or something else. So the other facet, and we touched a bit about it a little bit, is hydrogen is also an enabler of low carbon fuels. So I take as an example, we have a collaboration project to have a demonstration plant in NEOM to use green hydrogen. I think element one, by the way, of the NEOM green hydrogen project is going to be used by Aramco and few partners to produce methanol and methanol to gasoline to really test the integration of those sustainable fuels and use low carbon electricity as a starting point as a raw material to produce low carbon fuel that can go into the existing value chain. So this is more R&D. We also have R&D project on how we look at next generation reformers in order to increase the efficiency of reformers. We have to have R&D programs to look into the conversion of ammonia back to hydrogen in a much more efficient way. So all that will contribute to lower the cost, open market access. But fundamentally, I think today there is no lack of supply. We know how to make it. We have a good idea on how to get it efficiently produced. We know how to transport it. We have a view of what kind of ship we have to design. All we need, and I like the LNG FLNG because that's exactly the approach we're taking. We just try to make the 50 years happen in 10 years. But we need to get, in the end, an alignment with policymakers in Japan, Korea, and Europe to articulate how fast do we want this as a solution in the mix. And it's not a cheap solution, it's expensive. Decarbonization. And what do we do to enable our power sector, our industries to actually adopt it? And then it will go fast. But before that, the demand side is really today what's slowing us down.
Yeah. I completely agree with everything you were saying. I'd like to touch more on what Fahad has said with regards to the cheapest energy production will probably have most of the manufacturing shifting towards that area. And I completely agree with that. And in OQ, that's what we're looking at. We're saying, what can we do now to create demand internally, so in the country with our own facilities? So if we have aluminium smelters, can we produce green renewable energy and power that aluminium smelter? If we have fertilizer plants, can we substitute gray hydrogen with green hydrogen for our fertilizer? If we have ammonia plants, okay, we can do blue hydrogen, but also can we look at substituting also green hydrogen there? So you're trying to reduce your overall CapEx investment, you're trying to reduce your risk so that you can start stimulating the market. And then when you have that and you've tested the market, so if you are producing green ammonia at a lower cost than you would normally have done, then you can test the market and see, are people really willing to take this up? I think if I look at one company, which is Air Products, who's very bullish about the demand and they're willing to take as much offtake as they can when I look at them in projects around the world. And this presentation you've done, Patrick. So the demand maybe is there, and I think the customer side is going to be asking for it. So you see a lot of, not just customers, but also banks saying, look, if it's not green, we don't want to know about it. So I think that's going to come. But taking that first step, taking that risk is what's going to be important. I think Aramco's already in that direction. We're also in OQ discussing the same kind of approach about how do we take that risk ourselves and then see if we can build a market out of it.
Well, if you just look at the ammonia market, historically the ammonia market's grown based on population growth, 2 to 3%. From a demand standpoint, Olivier, now we're looking at ammonia for fuels. We're looking at Japan. I've talked with some people in your government, and just the needs for Japan increases the global demand for ammonia by 10%, and that's not including marine fuels. And so if you look at the demand in the global ammonia market, the projections are looking very good for that to be a strong market going forward. And as a result, technology companies are now looking at single plants that are twice the capacity as historic. We've talked about that as well. So the economies of scale are coming along as well. So it's an interesting and very dynamic and ever-changing market right now.
Well, not to forget that a bit more than a third of the existing 200 million ton of ammonia produced is made from coal.
Yes. Yes.
So that we should start by stopping that.
Oh, I understand that.
So there's a significant existing gray ammonia opportunity.
There's a decommissioning
and
a new
many
plant.
different other colors. Maybe talking about colors for a second, Teresa-Mazan, what's your view on what type of hydrogen and derivatives, ammonia, etc., would you see demand for? Green blue as a transition? What's your view on color theory? And then please everyone chip in. I'm sure this is a
Well, there are some colors attached to hydrogen and ammonia, and the green hydrogen is hydrogen to be produced from water using electrolyzer, and the power generated from renewable energies would be used for the electrolysis, and this would have the lowest carbon footprint, and this is called green hydrogen. And many of my European friends particularly like this green hydrogen or green ammonia, but at the same time, blue hydrogen, blue ammonia is another option, which is to produce ammonia or hydrogen from fossil fuels, in many cases natural gas. The CO2 will be emitted in the process, but you capture the CO2 and store it underground using CCS technology, and this is called a blue hydrogen, blue ammonia. And we have conducted a study to see the cost between green hydrogen or green ammonia and blue hydrogen, blue ammonia. And as of 2030, we have found generally speaking, blue hydrogen, blue ammonia to be significantly less expensive than green hydrogen and green ammonia. The cost of electrolysis is very, very expensive. And among the countries potentially producing blue hydrogen, blue ammonia, because the cost of natural gas matters a lot, the Middle East countries will be the ideal location to supply blue hydrogen, blue ammonia. So I agree with Fahad. The GCC countries would have great potential, in addition to green hydrogen, green ammonia, but in particular with blue hydrogen, blue ammonia, because you can utilize your natural gas, and also you have locations for carbon capture and storage. And finally, I should add one more point about the importance of blue hydrogen and blue ammonia. After the invasion into Ukraine by President Putin, many Western countries, including Japan, are now trying to find sources of LNG and natural gas other than Russia. So we have to invest in non-Russian sources of natural gas and LNG. But there are two questions surrounding this kind of investment decision. Investing in new projects for LNG and natural gas, how will it be consistent with our long-term goal of realizing carbon neutrality? And the relevant next question is that for the time being, people are scrambling to try to get LNG, so there's a market for the short term for sure. But what about the long term? Will there be market for this added expansion of natural gas or LNG? Will they become stranded assets? These are the questions that we would have to face if as we try to invest in non-Russian source of LNG and natural gas. These are not easy questions, but I believe that blue hydrogen and blue ammonia can be a bridge to answer these two questions. With blue hydrogen and blue ammonia, yes, the expanded supply of LNG and natural gas today will be consistent in the future with the carbon neutrality pledge by turning natural gas into decarbonized blue hydrogen, blue ammonia. And also, if we have the prospect of using the natural gas to produce blue hydrogen, blue ammonia in the future, yes, we would have a demand for the future. That would justify the investment that is needed today to diversify our dependence on Russia. So blue hydrogen, blue ammonia is cost effective, it helps the GCC countries, and it also helps resolve the dilemma between the short-term and mid-term necessity of investing in upstream, at the same time ensuring that we are consistent with our long-term pledge.
Yeah, so blue versus green, I think the way we look at that debate is going back to the basics of carbon intensity. So as we design our low carbon offering, we look at really production well of the hydrocarbon, all the way to delivering the molecule to the market, either delivered ammonia, or if you have to convert it to hydrogen, even the cost of and the energy efficiency of converting back to hydrogen. And you look at the carbon emitted there, and the most stringent standard today is Europe with 3.4 kilogram of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. And it's not easy to meet, by the way. You need a very low carbon intensity in your upstream. You need to really have very good scope 1 and 2 management, good sequestration solution. You need low carbon transportation, and you need very efficient conversion. It is possible. We think we'll be able to provide that transparency because we track all this. It's actually, we are the only producer of carbon in the kingdom, so we can provide that assurance. It's auditable, by the way, which is not necessarily easy to do elsewhere. If you buy gas in Henry Hub, you can't get a certificate telling you how much flaring happened, how much emissions, what's happening, what's the methane intensity. We have all that. Now, I think the problem becomes more difficult on what's the real footprint of green or renewable-based electricity, hydrogen. How did your electrolyzer run during the night? But also, let's imagine that picture where you have this very nice electrolyzer running off a renewable plant next to a coal power station. Why don't you use the renewable power to switch off the coal? So how do you look at, and I think that notion of additionality, time is what Europe is wrestling with. To say we need to really make sure that by moving that, we don't actually undermine green electrons going to the right place. And the most useful place of a green electron is actually to replace a dirty coal-based electron. And so that reality somehow will have also to transpire. So at the system level, the notion that green is zero carbon, I think, is extremely simplistic. And I think in the end, the governments will have to make standards about what they expect when they import renewable-based electricity. What do they expect from the country who has produced that renewable electricity in terms of their own electricity system? And they've not kept polluting the world just because they want to play in that export base. So I think this is a complex problem. It is easier to provide a transparency on the hydrocarbon-based, the so-called blue. But I think on the green, we'll have quite some debate moving forward on what makes it really, really helping the world decarbonize.
So I would add to what Olivier mentioned around, carbon intensity and being the right, metric. And I think we're already seeing that. I think we're already moving beyond colors. It's just a matter of a few years. And I think the precedent that has been set by the Inflation Reduction Act, by, the new Netherlands, standards for low carbon hydrogen, also the standards here in Saudi, which look at carbon intensity rather than the source. I think it's a much better metric to have, and I think this is what we're going to see. We're going in a few years stop talking about the source as Olivier mentioned, and look at the full cycle emission, and does that meet the standard or not?
And we see this in other industries, right? The chemical, the steel industry that I mentioned earlier. There had been a long-standing debate about electric arc furnace versus direct hydrogen reduction-based steel production, etc. What we are currently seeing in the markets, and the first distributors are going there, is to classify every single product of steel by its carbon content. No whether this was originally green or blue in terms of hydrogen, or electric arc furnace, or scrap, etc. It's purely how much kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of that specific long or flat or rolled type of steel product. And there are tens of thousands of products. And very much as you have a price and other quality features, you will have a carbon content feature in the future that sort of decides this. And then the color of the origin doesn't make a big difference. So I would wholeheartedly agree with this. Talking about green, nevertheless, scaling green hydrogen projects. Monsieur, any view on this? Despite all the demand and offtake challenges, let's assume the demand is there, it will scale.
I think we look at three key challenges. Actually, I'll talk about. There are many more, but I'll talk about three key challenges to scale up green hydrogen projects. I think the first one is looking at the supply chain. Second one is looking at the technology maturation, and the last one we talked about, which is the customer. So you said if I take the customer out, I'm left with two. So we've been looking at electrolyzer capacities, and if you look at the high efficiency electrolyzers, they are fully sold out for the next 2 years. You can't get them actually. Also, if you look at wind and solar, so wind is something that you need to get low cost hydrogen. Again, you have a really long waiting list to get the right wind turbines in place and get them done. The other part of it as well, if you look at the Middle East, we don't manufacture anything here. Everything comes from abroad. So that automatically increases our overall cost. So if you wanted to do wind in Europe, everything is done there. The cost is much lower, although labor costs are higher. But now you have to buy it. It's get built in Europe. It has to be shipped here and then constructed here again. When you look at technology, I think it's is it a wait and see game, or is it just going to jump in with 2 feet? So we talk about solar energy, and there's a promise of perovskites that can double your solar efficiency. So with the same cost, or just a marginally extra cost, you have twice as much solar energy as you need. Even the wind turbine technology is advancing quite fast. Electrolyzer technology also is being looked at to improve efficiencies. So it's really a balance about, should I invest now with the current technologies, or should I wait for some more maturation of technology to move forward? So for us, it's been very difficult. I mean, you talked about, Terezawa-san, about the increased cost of green hydrogen. That's what we're seeing. Although the experts and the consultants will tell you it only costs $4 per kilogram, the cost is actually quite much higher. And once you decide to actually build that plant. So how do we get these costs down so that countries like Japan, like Europe, see it as a good trade-off between being green and actually ensuring energy security? That's what I have on that.
Can I ask one question to Muther? Yeah. From Japan, as a consumer, in addition to having interest in blue hydrogen, blue ammonia from this region, we certainly have interest in the green hydrogen ammonia from this region. You have so much solar power and wind power as well. But the naive question from one living outside of the region is that to produce green hydrogen ammonia, you would need fresh water.
Correct.
So forgive me if I'm wrong, but there's absence of fresh water. You have to desalinate the salt water. It would require energy. It would require cost, and it may make the sea much more salty. Yes. So how would you, and you have to make it sustainable, ocean-wise as well. How can you overcome these potential challenges to be a green hydrogen ammonia producer?
Yeah, I think, so you're right. The desalination of water is a major issue that we have with respect to increasing costs. The quantum of water isn't that significant if you look at it relative to, say, desalination plants for urban living, basically, urban usage. There are technologies now that are being researched that is looking at electrolysis with saline water. And that's something, again, that comes into play. So if you can do that and you don't need to desalinate the water, then that drops the cost quite significantly. And it removes a lot of these issues. Of course, in Oman, we're on the Indian Ocean, so desalinating doesn't really make much of a difference. But I guess if you're pulling water from the Persian Gulf, as an example, that could be a big issue, yes.
Okay. I would want to encourage the audience to also submit questions. We've had 1 or 2 questions from the audience coming in. There should be a code somewhere, hopefully displayed here, where you can, using the slider tool, submit a few questions, and then we can share them with the panelists. Going back to the question of scaling green hydrogen, right? You talked a little bit about the demand side and big projects. You mentioned scarcity of electrolyzers. If you want to buy them right now, it is a challenge. Doug, looking a little bit at you, what's your perspective on the supply side on the green hydrogen? Perhaps first on the equipment side, and then Olivier on your side a little bit on the green electricity.
Yeah, from an equipment side, I liken the electrolyzer developments that are going on. There's a ton of money being spent on electrolyzer development to make them higher capacity, lower cost. But right now, it takes a whole lot of electrolyzers to meet a world-scale capacity ammonia or hydrogen plant. And so I liken it to kind of the early days of the computer chip developer, where the technologies are leapfrogging themselves. The different approaches from just the alkaline to the PEM approach to the solid oxide approach. So I'm not sure who's going to win right now at the end of the day. And so what we do is we watch that space very closely, and we have collaboration agreements with several of the providers. And so right now we're, depending on where a project is, what the needs of that particular project, and then we'll take our ammonia technology, and we're the integrators of the electrolyzer with the ammonia technology in order to move forward. And so we have found some projects, they tend to be about 10 to 20% of a world-scale ammonia plant today, and it's limited by, I'm talking about typical projects around the world. It's limited largely by the cost. It's limited by the technology. It's an interesting approach. A lot of the companies around the world have ESG investors. They have board of directors that want to see the energy transition start. And so some of these large fertilizer companies have started along the journey by saying, we're going to build a green ammonia plant that's 10% of a normal of a full capacity today, or 20%, to show their investors that we're doing something today. We know it's not going to be our ultimate solution, but we're acting now. We know there's going to be some improvements in technology, but we're not going to hold off and wait until everything's perfect, because we won't be able to get there from here. So they're starting to take some steps. I call it a do, learn, do model. They're kind of doing some things, they're learning, they're improving, and then the next round of projects I think will be larger capacity, they'll be lower cost. There will be developments because of scale. There will be developments because, improvements because of the investment that's being made in the technology.
I'd like to ask Terazawa-san a question with respect to, you said you'd like green hydrogen and green ammonia, but you don't want, or blue hydrogen, blue ammonia, but you don't want blue LNG, if I call it that, in terms of LNG with all the CO2 sequestered. Is that because there is no CCUS in Japan and no place to get rid of it when you burn the LNG, or is there some other reason?
No. If I have mistaken, being misunderstood, we don't care about the colors. We love green hydrogen and we love blue hydrogen, as long as they are cost effective and they are low in the carbon footprint.
No, what I was talking about is that why do you want hydrogen rather than LNG? Because we take the gas and we change it into the blue, if you talk about blue hydrogen, when you change it into hydrogen and ammonia, rather than give you the gas directly as LNG.
Oh, you mean getting LNG and burning them and having CCS?
Yes.
Right? Oh, the problem, that's one possibility, but the problem is that we don't have good locations for carbon storage nearby. So theoretically, we can procure LNG from Middle East, send it to Japan, and burn it and capture the CO2 and send the CO2 back to Middle East. It's possible.
Yes.
And in fact, it can be more cost effective. But we don't have the option of CCS nearby in Japan. In the future, we may have. But the only option is sending the LNG and sending the CO2 back. As of now, we consider, rather than doing that, having CCS here in the Middle East and produce blue hydrogen, blue ammonia, and send the blue hydrogen, blue ammonia to Japan and burn it will be much more, I think, realistic. And also the problem with the CCS approach is that if you have a single location burning LNG, you may be able to capture that the carbon. But the problem is that LNG is used among various players within Japan. You cannot capture CO2 everywhere. So if we are serious about CO2 reduction, I think it would be better to use the energy which is low carbon rather than trying to capture all the CO2 coming out. I hope that's the answer to your question.
Yeah.
Let's stick with you for a second, Terazawa-san. On the LNG side, Japan was one of the leaders of developing the equipment, right, in the global supply chains. What's your view on the opportunities in the hydrogen and the ammonia space? Is Japan just merely an importer of the commodity on the ammonia side, or are there significant?
Well, in terms of technologies, I think we have a great potential. We would have to import the blue or green hydrogen because we don't have those resources, but we do have the technology. Because for hydrogen or ammonia, burning them is not easy. It's very different from burning natural gas. So the technology would be necessary to burn the ammonia or natural gas, ammonia or hydrogen for thermal plant purposes. And if we choose to transport hydrogen in a liquefied manner, we need to have the development of new hydrogen tankers. And that will be technologically very challenging. So we see there will be great opportunities for Japan while buying blue hydrogen, blue ammonia, but providing the technologies to make those blue or green hydrogen possible.
And we have a question from the audience on the import to Japan. GCC versus Australia. Any indication on what's the more economic route, more preferred route, more viable one?
Well, actually, as I said, we conducted a study to compare the cost, and we compared the cost of importing green hydrogen, green ammonia from the US, Australia, and Chile. and Middle East. And we have found that among all the options, as of 2030, we have found the blue hydrogen, blue ammonia to be sent from Middle East as the cheapest. Among the green hydrogen, the ammonia, Chile seems to have an advantage as of now, but I have friends here who might have a different view. But in terms of green hydrogen, green ammonia, Chile provides a realistic challenge. But as for blue hydrogen, blue ammonia, GCC countries by far is the most competitive.
And maybe I take this question a little bit further, combining it with one of the other questions here from the audience. We talked a lot about producing low carbon hydrogen here in the region or in Australia and then exporting it to Europe or to Japan and Korea. What about reshuffling supply chains as such, right? If I look at the fundamentals, and even if I had to say this from a European perspective, but if the future is in low carbon hydrogen, and if the Middle East, Australia, Chile are so much more attractive from a fundamentals perspective in terms of availability of cheap green electricity, some of them even with desalinated water at hand, like, would you expect or do you actively foresee a relocation of supply chains globally?
Yeah, so definitively, when hydrogen is a key raw material to help produce low carbon products, let's take a steam cracker, right? So hydrogen is one way to decarbonize a steam cracker by taking the off gas, extracting the carbon. Then if you have a competitive advantage in doing that, and we probably will have, then you'd rather make low carbon polymers here than import hydrogen to make low carbon polymers in another country. So I think naturally low carbon polymers, and I think it's really an opportunity for the country here to say, well, we are going to be the winners in low carbon polymers, especially the one that can travel around the world quite easily. I could take the same. So steel is an interesting debate, because that's where Australia has both the iron ore and the low carbon hydrogen. So the notion of oxidizing your iron ore and then shipping that to make finished steel. If you had to do that here, you'd have to import the iron ore, do the DRI, and then export the steel. So that's why you could see some advantage for Western Australia doing it. So I think what you'll see is that these are the models that are there. I'll talk about low carbon fuels. So you have, of course, to have a renewable feedstock to be used, but the hydrogenation step can be done very effectively here.
Correct.
So if you think about we talk about methanol for a minute. This region is already very competitive in methanol. Then you look at low carbon methanol made from low carbon hydrogen would be even more advantaged here. So I think we'll see naturally remapping of product, and I agree with you that the hydrogen import doesn't have to be in the form of hydrogen itself. It can be from a product which has been decarbonized, and we will see that remapping. Another example is very simple. If you look at Japan and Korea, these countries don't make ammonia anymore. They make fertilizer, they import ammonia to make fertilizer. Europe still makes 10 to 15 million tons of ammonia. Why would you do that if now suddenly your gas is very expensive to import and your carbon is very expensive to get rid of? And importing, ammonia, hydrogen to make ammonia doesn't make sense. So I think what you'll see also is people will decide to actually why make ammonia in Europe if I can import it? Why make some fertilizer in Europe when I can import them? So you'll see a number of industries where competitive advantage will shift because of the ability to make low carbon product will be in a different place, and I think that's another advantage for the kingdom to play in.
As we are approaching time, maybe one last question, and then happy to get inputs from everyone. Building on that theme, right, and taking that thought a little bit further of the huge competitiveness that this region has, for the reasons we mentioned, what would governments need to do, not just to make it an attractive place for hydrogen and ammonia production, but to actually localize further industries, right, exactly along the theme that you mentioned, polymers, steel, others. What would be your wish list, if I may say so, to local governments? Opportunity is there. What would need to happen?
So I would say that government definitely needs to set the policy and be receptive to foreign investment. I think that's key. But I think in an era of post-COVID, where supply chain proved to be an issue, there is also rising geopolitical tension. There is this issue around supply chain, and would the world accept that? I think we see, for example, the EU CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and we're not sure if this is really about carbon accounting and making sure that there is a levelized playing field, or are we talking about actually protectionism with another name? And so it's very important. I think for the private sector and the industry players, rising competitiveness, you need to be competitive. And I think just relying on existing investment, existing cost advantage is not going to cut it. And you need to increase your competitiveness, whether cost perspective, but also maybe technology perspective.
Any other views?
Yeah, I think what the US has done with the Inflation Reduction Act is really, really good. And I think governments around the world should take notice and follow that stream of thought, because if they can be very competitive because they have a lot of incentives from governments, then it becomes much harder for us to be competitive if we don't have the same type of incentives. And I think governments need to look at this as a long-term investment rather than just, I want to build hydrogen plants, I want to export ammonia. But this is actually the future of energy. And how do I make sure that I take a leading position in this future? And I don't think it'll just happen by us trying to be competitive with respect to trying to build the plants cheaply, having been bestowed with natural wind and solar energy. I think government intervention is going to be very, very important to build that leading position.
Maybe a last statement. Yeah.
So yeah, I know from personal experience that right after IRA was passed, there was an immediate uptick in activity. I mean, the number of projects that were being studied and analyzed were then moving forward. So I think that any policy that gets action to take place, to get projects moving forward more quickly, so that, and I call it analysis paralysis. Stop the analysis paralysis and actually start. That's one thing that did happen, and I see it firsthand from those policies. So I don't know the specific policies in the GCC, but anything that moves companies, moves technology development, moves innovation forward are going to be really good to help solve this energy transition problem.
Thank you so much. I think we've talked a lot about the huge uncertainties that there are, but at least my personal summary would be that the opportunities outweigh, right? There will be pivoting, there will be pioneering required. Yes, there will be risk-taking. There might be winners and losers along the way, but the opportunity in particular for chemicals and petrochemicals, and even more so here in the region, I would say, is by far outweighing the risks and transition pain points and challenges. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for sharing your views. Thank you as well to the audience for being with us on this afternoon. And then I would suggest we close the session.